Good evening, comrades. Welcome to our final session in our series Life of the Left. We've had quite a lot of interesting working class heroes that we've looked at in the last few months, but it's coming to an end now. We were actually going to look at John McLean tonight, but unfortunately our speaker, Sandy McBurney, has got the flu, which is going around, and he doesn't feel up to it. He did say he would do it if we really insist, but it didn't sound like it's going to be a joyful occasion for him. So luckily, we've got our own Matthew Jones, who's volunteered to have another attempt of introducing Victor Serge. We did this a couple of months ago, and then his computer crashed, and we basically had 10 minutes. Interesting 10 minutes, but we're looking forward to a full session tonight. Thank you, Matthew, for stepping in. Take it away.
Okay, yeah, thanks, comrades. I'm hoping we can get, well, we should be able to get through this. I mean, obviously, it will be an abbreviated version because, as I was just saying to Tina about the life of Serge, it involves everybody in it. Sort of, it is an epic, and it sort of, almost the personification of sort of Russian Revolution over a series of decades, and so in that way. It covers many things. At the end, I'll put up a bibliography and so on, because obviously his main sort of inheritance is his legacy, is his writing. He was a great writer. So, I mean, Victor Serge or Victor Lvovich Kibolchich was a Russian-Belgian revolutionary. Interestingly enough, and he comes from the sort of his family, is a revolutionary family. His father, Leon Kibolchich, was reputed, and probably was, in the Narodnaya Volya, the People's Will, the revolutionary organization of the 1870s and 1880s, and was close to the conspiracy and the murder of Alexander II, which took place on the 1st of March. 1881. So in some ways, Victor Serge can be seen as a child of March the 1st. Anyway, so the Kibolchich family actually was a Montenegrin priestly family, but actually then obviously had a radical wing, because not only Leon was involved, but also his distant relative Nikolai Kibolchich was much more centrally placed in the conspiracy to kill Alexander II, and was hung for it. He's also famous as the first person to put forward the idea of manned rocket flight. Of course, he never had the chance to live to see that, but that's his other claim. So, in any case. Following the murder, the killing of the Tsar, Leon fled back to his family's usual residence in the Kiev area, and then subsequent to that, fled Ukraine to Austria. And the legend had it, of course, when he finally had to swim over the river to leave the Russian Empire, while being shot at. Typical. The bodyguards, bullets legendarily whistling over his head. Serge's mother was also, of course, part of that sort of element of a sort of feminist. Tradition in Russia, a revolt against the regime and against the imposition of repression on women in particular. She came from the Polish nobility, actually, in Nizhny Novgorod. Vera Porovskaya. So she actually was married in St. Petersburg, and then left. She was obviously suffered from tuberculosis, like many people did. It was in those days, of course, a disease which couldn't be cured. You had to live with it. Many people lived with it for decades. Anyway, so she left St. Petersburg and actually met Leon in Geneva, and they set up house together. They never got married, of course, because she was already married. And Victor was then Victor Lvovich Gilbertich was then born in Brussels in the last few days of 1890. In that legacy, and in that sense, also there's a sort of prime generation for the Russian Revolution. I mean, he was 2 years younger than Bukharin. There was that sort of cohort who were in their teenage years during 1905, who in their 20s in 1917 they were the core of the revolution. Obviously you had leading figures who were older like Trotsky and Lenin, and so on, who were like a decade older in Trotsky's case and 2 decades older in Lenin's case. As was put actually by the great poet Osip Mandelstam himself, murdered by Stalin. In a poem he wrote in captivity in one of Stalin's gulags of his life, and he was born a few days later than Serge, in the early days of 1891. He put it, I was born in the unreliable year of 1891, and the centuries surround me with fire, and that I think that really sums it up in many ways what that generation was like. Anyway, so Serge actually never went to school. His parents were always traveling, and he actually taught himself to read from his parents' library. And he became a political activist at quite a young age. Originally, of course, in Belgian Young Socialists. His parents actually split up by the time he was like 15, 16, and he left the household. He actually became independent, lived independently from when he was 15 or 16, and moved to actually left the Belgian Young Socialists. I think in part possibly because of disappointment in their politics. At that point, the Belgian Young Socialists had actually supported the empire in Congo and so on and so forth. They were becoming Van der Waal and so on, were becoming sort of bourgeoisified and so on. So he went to a more radical element of anarchism, which, I mean, it's really that surprising. Anyway, so he took up with it in an anarchist commune originally when he was a teenager, and then eventually, within a few years, of course, moved to that great centre of Paris, as you might expect, from the backwoods of Belgium, moved to the sort of political centre of Paris. And then he started writing at quite a young age, and took up, became actually editor of L'Anarchie, one of the main anarchist newspapers in Paris before he was 20, and started writing articles as under the pseudonym Victor Serge, as opposed to Victor Lvovich Kovalchich, by the time before he was 20. So he has a long history in those terms. He and his girlfriend, later wife, Riette, actually took over the editorship of L'Anarchie. But in 1911, 1912, there was around in anarchist circles in Paris, there was the infamous case of the Bono gang. Which was the sort of individualist element of the anarchism, which Serge was inclined to in some ways, but obviously described that some of it was quite crazy. But anyway, they basically took to banditry. This was also a tendency in among some anarchists. The notion of the thief and so on, the bandit was the ultimate sort of rejection of the system. Anyway, so there was obviously a police effort to crush the Bono gang and so on, and Serge was then arrested and essentially framed up as being sort of the intellectual eminent grise behind the Bono gang, that he was writing all the stuff and they were carrying it out and all this kind of stuff, which was all nonsense. I mean, in fact, of course, he was actually held on the basis that he would talk. He wouldn't inform anybody, and therefore he was in prison. He was then held in jails in Paris, or the Santo jail, infamous jail in Paris, which is now of course a tourist attraction. was then convicted in 1913 on the charge. Many of his the people he knew in the Barlow gang, of course, were I think 4 of them were sentenced to death. Among them, some people that Serge knew quite well. Serge was then, of course, imprisoned in Melun jail north of Paris. Which is still there. Discovered actually in researching this, Melun is still there. They're now debating. They started debating it apparently in 2021. This jail, which has been there, notorious place, is supposed to be replaced, but who knows when. Anyway, so this was Serge was not particularly physically strong character, and he nearly died at least once in this jail. This, of course, was. Interestingly, when he was in jail, he obviously the First World War started. Serge's thing on the basis of this was, of course, that he could see that this would destroy the Tsarist regime, which was his great, obviously his great focus for family reasons. Of course, the destruction of the Tsarist regime that his father had fled, and many of his relatives dedicated their time to get rid of, and that obviously that things would change, and he recounts with great joy that the terror of his wardens. Of course, being north of Paris, it was quite close to the front line, and they would either get crushed by this great war and roll over the jail, or they would be called up, in danger of being killed. So he's in that way also, of course, in some ways it was good because obviously he escaped being summoned up to the war. He at the start of 1917, he's released from jail but effectively thrown out of the country. Obviously as a convicted anarchist and undesirable. Along with a lot of other people, of course, he made his way to Spain, which of course was neutral at the time, and a major centre of the war industry. Had its own major anarchist movement, the CNT, FAI, and immediately connected with this sort of roaring war industry, brewing anarchist movement, anarcho-syndicalism in Barcelona. And he spent much of 1917 in Barcelona, associated with it. He was actually took part, was present for the uprising of the CNT in July 1917, and therefore knew the leading lights in Spain, which of course formed an important part of his life later. He left. Actually, of course, obviously during 1917 is the actual overthrow of the Tsar, which he'd seen, and he left Spain in October 1917, just at the point of just before the actual November Revolution, October Revolution, actually taking place in the Gregorian calendar in November. But it comes back to France, an effort actually to get back into. Or get back to Russia. Obviously, never having been there, but obviously that's his great sort of aim, and from the point of view, say from the familial thing, and he's imprisoned. Of course, he speaks, of the efforts of the French, of course, to either to conscript those who were supporting the Russian Revolution, or to repress them and so on, and he gets thrown in the concentration camp, which is probably better than what happens to some people, because obviously they wind up joining the Foreign Legion. As I said, either get killed in the front line, or else when they protest and revolt and so on, they get put up in front of a firing squad for mutiny. So Serge is held in this camp. Until after the First War, actually, for over a year, and in his camp he meets more Russian anarchists, a guy called Rusakov, who's an old Russian anarchist, and actually marries his daughter Lyova later, So he's then integrated into this sort of thing. So in many ways, I think we should look at Serge, and his as a sort of as a, first of all anarchist, and then when he goes to he finally makes it to Russia in 1919, through an exchange program. Effectively, by then there's a process of exchanging revolutionaries for those people captured by the Bolsheviks, etc., which, I mean, as he points out, was a swindle in some ways, because obviously some of the Russian revolutionaries included children who were then being exchanged one for one, and he makes it to the sort of wreckage of Russia. He speaks obviously this thing, it gets there and it basically everything's frozen. The place is in a terrible state. People are starving. The white armies are emerging, and they're starting the civil war. So he then from this anarchist background and without any real understanding of or knowledge of Marxism, decides to join the Bolsheviks. After at the start having volunteered himself. And he's the founder of the Secretariat of the Comintern, which I think he was definitely asked to do this. I mean, having volunteered to help out in the revolution, he actually started the Secretariat without ever actually being a member of the Bolsheviks at the time, which wasn't particularly unusual. that the people were brought in, to do jobs, and then recruited. So it was a very fluid time in those terms. So he then spends a series of years in terms of building up the revolution. He speaks obviously of the sort of wreckage of the place, and how they desperately trying to reconstruct things. The growth of a bureaucracy, which he describes as incredible. We're going to these offices in which you have all these people and basically have no real effect on anything that happens outside of the office. But there's sort of this, and other people, of course, who work themselves into the floor in an effort to make things livable, or to get food supplied, or whatever, or to, in fact, of course, defend the place. And this, I think, this also is the origin of his great admiration of Trotsky, because it is, of course, the effort of the whites to take Petrograd, where he bases himself, when the place is in a case of prostration, and everybody's predicting, well, Petrograd will fall, and there's desperation, and Trotsky then, of course, turns up with the famous armored train and his group of revolutionaries and military operatives, and they said, well, we can't sacrifice this enormous proletarian city to some tiny army of officers. There's no way that these people will be allowed in here. And so obviously he changes the whole basis of the thing, and manages to hold off this army at the last possible point, and the last possible moment, right in front of the gates of Petrograd, while at the same time threatening the Finns, who, as Serge rightly points out, obviously this small white army can't actually subdue Petrograd. What's required is for the Finns to deal the death blow, and obviously Trotsky then threatens them with various things. And this succeeds, and of course, there's this sort of heroic point at which the Russian Revolution rises from the dead. I mean, at one point, actually, Lenin did say, "Look, we're dead. I mean, we're finished," because they didn't control most of Russia, and they had this small bit in the middle, basically, and we're just waiting for somebody to finish off. And of course, they didn't. And it is, Trotsky actually builds, and those around him, but obviously Trotsky is the leader, builds an army from nothing, or very little. I mean, obviously, there were a large number of people who have military experience, but in terms of an organised army, they actually only had one division. Famously, the Red Army is built on one division of Latvians, the Lettish Fifth and Fifth Lettish Rifles, and this was done under fire. It's an extraordinary story. One deserves further investigation. Anyway, Serge also describes, some of the crazy things that goes on. I mean, in terms of, say, there is the Bolsheviks would print old Tsarist banknotes, which of course were completely worthless, and then exchange these for arms. But basically give the banknotes to the Finns, and the Finns would supply them with weapons, which was probably one of the most bizarre transactions on the face of the planet, because obviously the banknotes were worthless unless the Bolsheviks were defeated, in which case if the Bolsheviks were defeated, then obviously the banknotes would probably be honoured by somebody at some basis. But yet they were supplying arms, which was allowing the Bolsheviks in order to fight and maintain the worthlessness of the banknotes. It's incredible. So there you are. Anyway, so as I say, Serge starts as the secretariat, the Comintern, which becomes his main, one of his great legacies is building that. And in fact, he one of the two other people devised the great seal of the Comintern. So after living in this wreck for a couple of years, he decides to move to Germany in 1922 in order to, obviously basing himself in Berlin, which is the great centre of the Comintern outside, in Europe, and then of course goes through that whole process in terms of the wreck of Germany. Speaks, says, well, okay, the Germany was prostrate in a different way. Obviously, I mean, had been forced to sign the Versailles Treaty. He went through the great inflation, which of course he remarks on, compares ironically to the Russian inflation of earlier. So, well, we never paid more than $1 million for a lemon, but obviously far worse in Germany. 1923. And then, of course, the whole business of the failed uprising in 1923, which is basically a fit-up in which Zinoviev and some of the people running the KPD at the time attempted this uprising and called it off the last minute. And just making a mess, discrediting themselves in the eyes of almost everybody, apart from, and worse still, of course, they didn't inform, they didn't manage to get the message the thing had been called off to the cadre in Hamburg, who actually then proceeded to take the city and then had to retreat in the face of obviously the counter from the cops and the army and so on. It was a total and absolute mess. And that was the last effort, the uprising. And obviously we'd seen, previous to that, been a serious uprising in various places, Hungary and Munich, various Soviets in various parts of Europe. But that really was the end of it. Serge then moves to Austria and Vienna. And stays there in turn, in some ways that he distances himself from the machinations of the bureaucracy and so on, the Comintern. He speaks obviously of the nature of what's going on, and spends a couple of years in Vienna and Prague and so on, and talks to people from various places. Illustrates all the mess that was going, and returns to the Soviet Union in 1926 as obviously the great factional battle for the leadership of the Soviet Union begins to heat up, and really what you're seeing then is the a great despair among that, as I say, that cadre of people who fought the revolution and succeeded in the revolution in appalling conditions. And now, of course, the thing was, actually dissolving itself, and the bureaucracy was taking over. Serge, of course, took the part of Trotsky's left opposition, obviously, but he speaks all of the as he goes back to Moscow and Petrograd in 26, 27, of this great epidemic of suicide, and not just of obviously of great revolutionaries. Joffre, notably in 27, kills himself before Trotsky is expelled from the party. Also of the likes of Evgenia Bogdanovna Bosch, who had been another one of the great cadre of Bolshevik women, the first female president of any country as president of Ukraine, the only female president of Ukraine in all history, and a representative of that great generation. Also, of course, is himself as an artist, seeing at the same time that effect. The arts, this great sort of, if you like, a boom in the arts, in the period running up to the revolution. And subsequently, so you see Yesenin, who's a great poet, a fabulous poet. Worth going to read Yesenin stuff, and not a party man, but I mean somebody of huge cultural significance, shoots himself, or hangs him, he hung himself. Mayakovsky, of course, who was briefly a member of the Bolshevik Party. Left at one point, and was in for some sort of, but and then never rejoined, but became the leading figure of the sort of cultural side of the revolution. In many ways, if you look at the graphic representation of revolution, much of it is Mayakovsky. In terms, there's certainly the cartoons and so on and so forth, and the caricatures and all that sort of stuff, and a great poet at the same time. He kills himself in 1930, having been forced to write, forced to write what the bureaucracy wanted him to write, and he just got fed up with it and killed himself. And this is marks the end of this great sort of cultural boom. And then he deals with this great repression of all of his comrades. Obviously the Trotsky being thrown out of both the party and also the Comintern, one after the other, and the repression. He himself, of course, is arrested in 1928, interrogated and so on. Actually, ironically, of course, in the old Petrograd jail, and one of his jailers is one of those people who'd actually been Trotsky's jailer in 1906. See, things go all the way around. This sort of basically the use of the police state and the NKVD, which come out of the Vycheka, against the party itself. I mean, it obviously been used against the society generally, particularly of various kinds, and now it's moving towards into the party. So really, the interesting thing is that as Trotsky's exiled and so on, and the rest of them are exiled, is that of course he's then almost left in isolation. Although there is a small left opposition cell in Petrograd, and he decides in the early, I think 1930 or thereabouts, to turn to writing. Because that's what the only option he really has in terms of activity, and he decides to start writing novels and so on and so forth, particularly obviously novels. And this probably actually saved his life, because then he's able to write despite this sort of isolation, the fact that he's moving around, but he can't actually do anything officially because you have to get permission to have a room in a hotel. He found that if you went to Moscow, the best thing was to find a house which had already been raided by the political police, the NKVD, and stay there because people there didn't care. They'd already been done, and they thought they would be done again, and therefore, having a tourist left positions in the building wasn't any worse than they were in the position that they were already. So he starts writing, and he writes, things like men in prison, about his experience in prison in the First War, and the birth of our power, about his experience in Spain, and so on. He wrote a series of books, particularly at this point, novels, and he manages to get them published in Paris. Obviously he can write in French, and he can get this stuff published in Paris, which, as I say, probably saves his life, because when he's arrested again, finally arrested in 1933, most of everybody else has been arrested long since, and exiled to Orenburg, which is the Urals. Back in the nowhere, and again put in a position of near starvation. But because he's now a known published novelist and an artist in Western Europe, there is then a campaign to get him out, which wasn't the case for the bulk of of those arrested, the oppositionists and so on and so forth, those unfortunate revolutionaries who were put in that position. So he spends, he's in jail, in exile, or he's in exile, to say, in a condition of near starvation, in effectively a sort of slightly more open version of the Gulag, and there's a campaign to get him out. He actually gets out in the end in April 1936, just before the Moscow trials. It shows you that the Moscow trials were, not something they planned for a whole period, because there's no way if they had been doing that, there was no way they would let him out. So he gets out, and actually, of course, he gets back to Petrograd, and of course, the NKVD have seized some of his manuscripts, and he shows signs. He wants to sort of argue with them and say, "Look, you've let me out. I'm going to leave the country, but give me my manuscripts back, you rotten bastards." And of course, people say, "Well, look, they're get out first, because these people will kill you if you hang around." So he leaves, and shortly thereafter, of course, the Moscow trials start, and if he'd been there at that point, he would have been killed, no question. So he's very lucky in that sense, and he winds up back in Belgium and then France in 1936 as a sort of in exile as an oppositionist, close to Trotsky, but not having a certain distance in terms of his obviously completely different political background and so on, and he goes through this whole piece. He's also, of course, very close to the Spanish. He's very close to the whole business over the Spanish Civil War, because he knows all the people who started the coup, and he therefore is deeply associated with that movement. He's fighting to basically also to be published. I mean, he's writing. Having started writing, he carries on writing. But of course, he finds it very, very difficult, because he's obviously the right wing don't see him published, and the Stalinists don't want to see him published. And of course, between the two of them, they can block much of his output. So he's then obviously in France. I should add, actually, as a piece I should have said, having married in 1920, he has a child, Lyova Rusakova, his wife, and he have a child who is Vladimir Kubalchich, otherwise known as Vladdy, who actually became a very famous Mexican artist, ironically enough. But I'll go through that in any case. So, 1920 as a child. So Vladdy and Leo would then, obviously go with him with all this peace. Leo was not very well. Actually, when he has to flee France. Obviously with the advent of the Nazi invasion, 1939, 1940, he has to flee France. She is left behind in a mental asylum. He winds up in this situation. It's an extraordinary sort of situation in Marseille, where you have a gathering basically of all sorts of people of the left of various traditions, etc., all campaigning and desperate to get visas out of the falling France, all subject to the depredations of either the Stalinists or the fascists or whoever, and therefore it's a very, very dangerous place to be. Eventually, Serge is lucky because obviously he's much luckier than many, of course. Unlike the usual nonsense, of course, is that as we know, there were huge numbers of Jewish people, obviously danger from the fascists, and really the likes of British and Americans have no interest in allowing vast numbers of people to flee the Nazis, unlike the nonsense that come up these days. So Serge eventually manages to flee. He gets to Cuba and then Mexico, and becomes a refugee in Mexico, along with his friends from Spain. Some of he actually lives his last years out with some of his comrades from the POUM in Spain. He broke with Trotsky over the whole question of the Spanish Civil War in 1938, because of as I say, he was close to the POUM. Trotsky was savagely critical of the POUM, obviously for basically taking part in the Popular Front government and a number of other issues. Most people would see that Trotsky's critique was fair, but it became this whole question, and of course there was the difference in terms of the whole Trotsky's effort to set up the Fourth International, which was quite, as we know, quite marginal and difficult. So he lives his last few years in Mexico. Again, this is a problem for all sort of theme of Serge's life, in many ways, in poverty. And writing stuff, and he carries on writing. He's a tremendous output, but of course can't get published. So if you see a lot of Serge's stuff, actually, of course, is again with a lot of other people on the left, is published posthumously, and I think there's probably still stuff that's still being worked on in those terms. So even into the 2000s, I think they're still publishing new Serge stuff. So he died 1947, a few weeks before his 57th birthday. So in those terms, in many ways, quite a tragic life, but in other terms, an epic. It's an epic. He goes through all these events. As he said himself, he lived through 3 generations of revolutionaries, and was almost, the sole, one of the few survivors of all of them. Obviously, he goes through the Bono gang, as he says, this group of anarchists. He survives that in Paris. He goes through Spain. He goes to Spain, as I say, after in 1917. His comrades who were present with him for the uprising in 1917 are particularly he's close to excuse me, the leading figures, and they are mostly killed. Many of them by the Spanish ruling class, who run this thing. Basically, what was called the Sindicato Libre, the Free Union, which is essentially a bunch of death squads. who went around killing revolutionaries and anarchists, so anarchists and other leftists. So that generation is in many suffers from that. Finally, of course, he's in the Bolshevik Party, and he's one of the few survivors of the Bolshevik Party. And in fact, of course, after obviously the killing of Trotsky in Mexico in 1940, he speaks to Natalia, Trotsky's widow. He said, "Well, we are now some of the very few people left in the world who understand the Bolsheviks, what the Bolsheviks were actually like, what they, how they did things and how they thought and how the whole thing worked." We're sort of left with this in this situation. So, as a final piece, I'll show you a couple of. I've been disabled for screen sharing. If Tina will let me share, I can show you some pictures and a bibliography. I can,
sorry, try now.
Okay, so I can probably get that. Oh, there you are. Yeah, right. So the first picture on the left is Serge. I think this is 1920 or so. The point at which he's founding the Secretariat of the Comintern. 1919. The second one is Serge and his son and his wife, Lyova and Vladi, which is taken in 1928. So then you can also go through. See, this gives you a view of some of Serge's bibliography. There's some brilliant books in here. Birth of Our Power. Again, you can see, these are published in the early 30s in Paris. First issue, Case of Comrade Tuliev, published later. It's a brilliant book. People should absolutely, if you haven't get a chance to read, Case of Comrade Tuliev is fabulous. There's also, of course, famously his Memoirs of a Revolutionary, which is so good I've actually got 2 copies of it. It's a brilliant book. The thing is about Serge, he's a great writer. I mean, an epic life and a great writer, and absolutely, people should read him. He's not particularly theoretical, but he's just brilliant writer. So, thanks.
Thank you very much, comrade. Can you manage to stop screen sharing?
Yeah. There
we go. Very interesting. Thank you very much, Matthew. It was worth waiting for. Comrades, if anybody's got a contribution to make or a question to ask, please click raise hand or put your comments in the chat. So I know you mentioned briefly at the end there the books that you recommend. What's the best book you think for newcomers?
Memoirs of a Revolutionary, which is just about his life. It's just a great read. Something you can read and wherever. I mean, obviously there's other things about his life which are not in it, but I mean, just as a thing, he goes through 40 years of his life in epic sort of style, because obviously he just goes through all these different events, major events in terms of world history. And as he said himself, the only reason for living is to make history.
So, in his involvement with the German Revolution, how close was he to? Sorry, I had to make dinner for my kids. You did touch on it, but how close was he to Liebknecht and Luxembourg, and how critical was he of what happened there and how it all went a bit wrong?
He doesn't come to, you see, he comes to Germany after that. He comes to Germany in 22, so he doesn't have that. He speaks of, obviously of the, that he's dealing with the KPD as it became. So he's after that period. So there's like 3 years after the killings of Rosa and Karl. And you have this big thing, and he talks of the sort of ethos of the KPD and the different elements of it, and under conditions obviously in which you know, the German Revolution really is a total mess. I mean, one after the other. You've got things. I mean, obviously the whole series of events. Obviously the January 1919, and then the Kapp Putsch of 1921, and then obviously the mess of 1923. And in each of these cases, you know, the wrong decisions are made. You know, quite. And that whole opportunity is destroyed and lost. Yeah.
Also argue that the German Communist Party wasn't founded early enough, which is what a lot of.
Well, obviously the German Communist Party comes out of, you know, is founded by oh god, it's actually organised by a Lithuanian. Extraordinarily enough, Yogish. A man so you know, underground that nobody, I don't think anybody's actually worked out what his actual birth name was.
Right.
Brilliant organizer.
Well, that went on the trouble with the German working class. They couldn't quite defeat them, but
that was the thing. You know, the opportunity was there, and the opportunity was missed. You know. They you know, the whole business of, you know, you look at the debate around the whole question, you know, how do you deal with the phenomenon of the independent SPD? You know, do you send people into parliament? The whole question then of obviously the right wing Kapp Putsch, and how does the KPD respond to that? And they, you know, again, they messed that up. Yeah. So, but that's another debate.
It does show the role of leadership, how important it is, how
absolutely.
lucky, or you know, the Russians were that they had Lenin. I mean, lucky, you know.
Well, yes, people, Trotsky makes the point. He said, yes. I mean, you know, he said, you know, the Russian Revolution happens providing Lenin is there.
Yes.
You know, providing Lenin is there. He's that central. You know,
and of course, Lenin said the international revolution will only happen if the Germans make it, and they fucked it up for various reasons.
Serge makes the point. You know, he says in 1924 when Lenin dies, you know, he sees this in he's on a train and he sees the newspaper headlines among all these sort of quite bourgeois Austrians, and they're you know, commenting on how, you know, the significance of Lenin. So, you know, obviously he's had this huge mark on the whole of the society. Whether, you know, that he was that profound in those terms.
You can have similar situations and you make the wrong decisions, and it all ends up in a totally different situation. It's also interesting when you mentioned that he was basically made into one of the key people of the Comintern without any knowledge of Marxism or revolutionary politics. How did he get into that position? How does that happen?
Oh, the thing is, he was obviously, the Bolsheviks were quite open. Well, one, of course, the Russian Revolution, of course, desperately needed people to do things. You know, he was obviously learning Marxism. He decided pretty early on, you know, once he got there, that obviously the Bolshevik Party was the thing. So he starts looking at Marxism, and they desperately need people to get this thing running. So there's like, he and one other were then given a table in a room and said, right, okay, your thing is to start the Secretariat of Comintern, come up with a seal, you know. And the other guy was a guy called Lichtenstein Marzin, who was an ex-left social revolutionary, you know. And it was like that.
Oh. Well, revolutionary times, and everything changes within very few days, weeks, etc. Preston has put in the Q&A that apparently when Victor Serge died in 1947, all that he owned was a typewriter, nothing else, and basically in poverty. Is that?
Yes, I mean, essentially that was the thing. You know, said you know, he apparently he died in the back of a taxi. He got in the taxi and had a heart attack, died, and his son says, you know, his son came to collect his body, and they wrapped up a rag around his face to close his mouth, and they said, you know, finally the state has closed the mouth of this man. You know.
And his wife lived into the 1980s in France.
Yes. She was in a mental asylum, which I mean, it's just, you know, but Vladimir lived until 2005, and he was accounted a great when he was alive. Of course, the regime in Mexico was he had all these arguments with them, and he spent the time taking the piss out of them in art and all this sort of thing. As soon as he died, he became a great Mexican hero artist. Because he painted these enormous. He was a mural painter, you know, obviously, in the tradition.
Interesting. We've got no questions or comments at the moment. Do you want to sum it up somehow? What's the key lesson we should learn from Victor Serge?
I think the thing. I mean, the thing about Victor Serge is he's. I mean, one, honest. I mean, I think the thing is he's honest, you know. And then also he's brilliant at writing. He just, you know, he manages to, because people say, you know, he can write, you know, summon up a scene in a few words, you know, and you know, had this sort of great characterization of people, you know, characterize all these people, and he spoke to and knew everybody. So you got all these people who are, you know, if you read his stuff, you can see the sort of, especially, I mean, I suppose memoirs, of course, you can see all this stuff. And you know, then you go off and say, oh, you know, who was so and so, and what did they do, and all this sort of thing. And the thing is, when you sort of do that, you see how little there is on some of these people. Obviously, many of whom were obviously great, you know, revolutionary activists of huge standing, but only there's things in terms of a few of them, but just not. You know, there's a lot more stuff that you need to that should be explored and written about a lot of these old Bolshevik activists, because obviously the problem was they were exterminated, and the fact that, you know, as I say, he refused to be silenced, you know, despite the fact the level of oppression, you know, because both from the right and the bourgeois, and also from the Stalinists, because the Stalinists didn't want him to have the access to publication either. So he said, you know, described, you know, writing, as he said, you know, past the age of 50 and writing to the desk drawer, you know. So I would suspect there's probably more Serge to come out. But you know, certainly, as I say, just read his stuff. It's great.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I think that was a fantastic final session to our series. We could carry it on, probably should actually. It's a great service to the movement, I think, to look at some of these people that have often been forgotten as well, or have been sidelined by historians in favor of, you know, other more mainstream historical figures. So we've shed a light on a few dozen of them. It's a good start. We could consider continuing this at some stage. It was certainly very interesting. Thank you, Matthew. Comrades, that was the last session in our series. Next week, as you know, we are participating in a new series with other groups and individuals called Why Marx, and we want to look at why we should study Marx and what were the revolutionary things they taught us, him and Engels. It wasn't just Marx. So next week is the introduction series. It's also on Zoom at 7 o'clock on a Thursday. I'll put the link again into the chat. It's a new link, so if you want to come along to that, you'll have to re-register. It's not run by the LLA exclusively, but we are participating in it. And hopefully this, perhaps, you know, it's seeing how it goes, but it should, you know, the logic of something like that leads to discussions around what kind of party, what kind of organization we should be having on what political platform. So I'm looking very much forward to it. We've produced a TikTok video as well. Look for it. It's out there. It's brilliant. Well, don't get too excited. But thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Matthew. And hopefully see you next week at 7 o'clock on a Thursday. Bye-bye, comrades.
Cheers.